Joshua, pleasure to have you here. I know we've been going a bit back and forth trying to get this organized. We've both been dealing with stuff, but yeah, really excited to have this conversation with you today, and yeah, can't wait to go through everything. Just going to go through the usual rigmarole, and you know, to kind of get yourself familiarize yourself with the audiences if they may not be fully aware of you and what you've been doing. Do you mind giving just a quick, you know, overview, a bit about yourself, what your interests are, and yeah, and then we can kind of go from there.
Certainly. I oftentimes say that this is probably the wrong thing to lead with because it makes me sound like a narcissist, but well, let me reframe it. I often feel like I'm constantly a fish out of water because my life is bifurcated across two separate domains. The first of which is music. I'm a classically trained tuba player. Don't play a lot of classical music now, although I do pick up the occasional gig here and there. But most of what I do is jazz and commercial styles, especially New Orleans music. So, you know, I sit in on the gig, and inevitably somebody else that's on the hit comes up to me and is like, what's this UFO thing that you're interested in? And then, you know, when I'm over in the UFO cryptid fairy parapsychology space, they say, what's the thing with the tuba? So I always feel like a fish out of water. But yeah, so that's what my life is. I'm a jazz tuba player in Atlanta, Georgia. And I also write books on all things unexplained. My passion knows no bounds for these topics. My first book was in 2015. I sort of got pulled into it, not entirely of my own volition. I saw some things that I thought deserved being talked about, and I was like, well, someone should write a book on that. And then, you know, after a while, you're sort of like, wait, is that supposed to be me? So, and then of course, you know, you associate your name with this stuff, and at least back then, like 10 years ago, it's gotten better since, but at least back then you associated your name with this stuff, and like it was kind of over. Like you were wedded to that for the rest of your life. But it was met with, much to my surprise, a lot of support and success. There were people reviewing my books that I was reading in middle school, which is always really surreal to me. Since then I've written 7-ish books, depending on how you count them, because some are split in two. 7-ish books on nonfiction and 1 fictional novel as well. And I just transitioned this year to being a full-time author and musician, which is something I never thought I would say.
Nice. Congrats. I think it's always, you know, when you start these things, I think always you working it on the side, and then with a view to build it up into something full-time. Because realistically, right, even though people watch this, we do love this domain, but you need to pay the bills, right, at the same time as well.
Right. Well, it's like I've been telling people ever since I made this switch. You know, I don't write books to make money. I make money so I can justify writing the books. You know what I mean? Because everything that I've written has not been a cynical decision. It's been because I think I have something to say, and I want to sort of contribute to the community and have interesting conversations like the one we're having right now. So yeah.
Cool, super. And I mean, just out of interest as well, because there's loads of different creative elements to it as well. I mean, why music out of interest? Some people like to write, draw. What resonated with you with music?
Well, it was something else I kind of stumbled into, I suppose. My sister was involved in the marching band, in the color guard, and I wanted to be a part of that experience. But you know, the band director takes one look at me, and they have a shortage of tuba players, and I stand about 6'3", so he's like, tuba. So I just sort of got it tossed onto me. But again, it was one of those things that I showed an aptitude for really early on. You know, and I've noticed this with working with students myself. There are some people who just step up to the instrument and are already a couple of months ahead of everybody else just because they intuitively approach it the right way. And I apparently was one of those kids. That's been a long and winding road, though. You know, I was following the classical music trajectory all the way into my postgraduate work, and then I had basically the musical equivalent of a performance injury with my lips. Just basically overuse. And that's when I made the real pivot towards these jazz and commercial styles, because the level of scrutiny and the sort of things that are expected from that domain are a little bit different than what you expect from classical. Of course, with that transition, things eventually cleared up for me, and now I feel, you know, just about as good as I ever did. But what that ended up is putting me in this odd position of sort of finishing a master's in music and then being like, okay, now what do I do? You know, what do I do with my life? Yeah. So I ended up pivoting to get a master's in journalism as well. Because the only person really that was asking me to work, encouraging me to go into music was my high school band director. Everybody else was like, Josh, you need to write. So here I am looking at 40 and I'm doing both, which feels really gratifying.
Yeah, that's cool. That's cool. Well, that's what I mean. You start with something anyway, right? And then it usually, you kind of try things out, and you can be good at it as well, but you can definitely pivot to other things that resonate with you and things that, you know, like you do years ago where you didn't want to dabble in as much, pop up later on in your life, and then you're like, oh, that makes sense. Well, and then you start to kind of use that experience as well. So that's cool. It's just good to kind of get an understanding anyway, because music's important.
Well, absolutely. And you know, something that I keep coming back to is I've been involved in this paranormal area enough, and this might sound more sinister than I really intend for it to, but I've been in this long enough to have seen some people sort of go off the deep edge with some things. Partially, I think that's the nature of these phenomena, but also just like, you know, there's the nature of being obsessive. And as someone who is diagnosed obsessive compulsive disorder myself, it really helps to be able to say, okay, the part of my brain that works on books and is obsessed with things that go bump in the night is shut off. And now I'm in music world, you know, and about half an hour into playing, you know, whether it's a rehearsal or just my own daily routine or at the gig, I'm not thinking about, you know, UFOs at all. I'm thinking about music, and I'm like, man, I should just do this all the time. And inevitably, you know, after the gig, I'm like, man, I'm tired. I never want to touch the horn again. I can't wait to write again. So, but I really think having sort of that grounding in an alternative space with whatever you do is a really useful thing that has benefited me a lot, and I think others should embrace that possibility as well.
Absolutely, we all need. I mean, I told you just before this as well that I've got football after this. Right, that's my form right there. I mean, I'm creative as well in other elements, but when I play football, I don't think about anything. I'm just there in the space, and I feel so euphoric after as well. I feel like I've had a really good. I mean, some people like to go gym. I find it personally boring. I've been to gym. I just can't get my head wrapped around it. But for me, it's football where I just get lost and I just play, have a great time, and then I'm competitive as well, and you can finish it. But you're right, we all need that something there to kind of switch off our mind, and then you can come back to, because if not, it's all, because I'm quite obsessive as well, you get so involved with it, you kind of miss things as well, and it gets a bit overwhelming, and you need to kind of just park that and just take a breather. It's equilibrium. That's what I've learned about this whole thing as well. But super. All right. And then, so then what happened with, how did you get into UFOs then?
Oh my goodness. There? Well, it's a great question. And I've answered this question a lot, and I still am not satisfied with my answer to a certain degree. But, you know, this interest was always latent inside me to a degree. The UFOs less so. I was what I would describe as a creature kid. You know, the first film that I ever saw was the 1933 King Kong. And I've just always been into, you know, creatures and monsters. I mean, you know, there are two types of I've noticed this. There are two types of young boys that I've experienced throughout my life with my nephews and my own sons. They're like, you know, the construction truck, the construction vehicle boys, and the dinosaur boys. I was a dinosaur boy. You know, so I was very much into monsters, and, you know, Stan Winston was a revered figure to me by the age of like 8 or something, because of all his great creature work. So I think that's a lot of what it has to do with my interest. Because I jumped on the Bigfoot bandwagon pretty early. I discovered later that my dad was always interested in Bigfoot as well. But, you know, to that extent, like, you know, I would pick up books from the library on things like Bigfoot and mysteries in general. I avoided the UFO topic for a long time because even back then, I think something about the extraterrestrial hypothesis didn't really sit with me. And now that's most of what I do is push back on the extraterrestrial hypothesis. Anyway, so this was always in the background. Every couple of years, I'd buy a book on Bigfoot or something strange. And then in 2012, I got a desk job at the University of Georgia as a public affairs director for the School of Music. And it was an hour commute there and an hour commute back. And that was, I still look fondly on that era as sort of like a golden age of paranormal podcasts, because, you know, there weren't a lot of people making stuff up that you run into with a lot of the stuff online lately. And a lot of the stories were, kind of quite fresh back then, as opposed to being repeated ad infinitum. So I was listening to paranormal podcasts, and that really reignited all this stuff in me. And I do remember that around 2014-ish, one of my sister-in-laws got me an Amazon gift card that I used to indulge in a Bigfoot book, which was J. Robert Alley's Raincoast Sasquatch. It's a great book. And there's a passage in there where he talks about, I believe it's the Kakwakiwak Bigfoot analog, which is the Bequus. And they said that if you accept food from the Bequus, you'll be trapped with the Bequus forever. And I'm like, that sounds a lot like fairy folklore, where if you accept food from the fairies, you're trapped there forever. And I'm like, that Alaska's pretty far from Ireland and and the UK. It's like, how do you explain that? I said somebody should write a book on that. And then that was the when I had that moment, was like, am I being called to do this? So that was my first book, 2015's A Trojan Feast, The Food and Drink Offerings of Aliens, Fairies, and Sasquatch, looking at that sort of food taboo and just the exchange of food and drink in these encounters. And since then, it was, I suppose, part of what my sort of guiding ethos has been has been to take a look at these things that people will mention or remark upon in a sentence or a paragraph at the most, and then they tend to go on their way. And I'm like, wait, hold on, run it back. Let's focus on this one thing that you sort of mentioned in passing. Can we pull that apart? Can we tease it out? Can we figure out if that says something deeper, or maybe offers some sort of other insight into the phenomenon itself? And has been a very rewarding trajectory for me.
What's been the in terms of that little process there of opening something up? Was there anything in particular which, I mean, you mentioned the thing on the train, you mentioned the food similarities, but is there anything in particular which really connected it to the UFO topic for you?
Oh, with the food and drink exchange?
Yeah.
Well, it sort of goes hand in hand with my, quite frankly, at this point, cynicism regarding the extraterrestrial hypothesis. The thing that never really sat well with me was, well, number one, I was terrified of alien abduction, so that probably had something to do with why I avoided the UFO literature for so long. But the other thing was this sort of plurality of craft and entities that were visiting us. And I was able at the time to buy into like one race visiting us, but not 100 different races and an even more diverse array of craft. But then I stumbled on, these similarities in some of those early podcast days of UFO experiences as compared to altered states of consciousness, UFO experiences as compared to fairy folklore, the Jacques Vallée Passport to Magonia stuff. And the congruencies there were so striking to me that I was like, oh, okay. So when I did hear something about, that one Bigfoot tradition mirroring fairy traditions, and it's like, well, of course, by extension, it seems like it would apply to a certain degree to the UFO phenomenon. Nowadays, I have to pull myself back from saying that UFO phenomena and fairy folklore are the same thing. I can certainly say that the Venn diagrams overlap a great deal.
Yeah.
But, as far as that sort of food taboo, that food exchange, don't take food from the thing or you'll be stuck with the thing idea, that was really striking to me because I only see three explanations for that, right? For the similarity between those two bodies of folklore as they are separated by, half a world. One of three possibilities, right? Either the collective unconscious is a real thing, which is wild to consider, or there was indeed an international exchange of cultural concepts that we don't recognize, which is, again, staggering and astounding. Or these stories are so similar because people are objectively interacting with something other than themselves, and they're learning the same lessons, separated by distance. Those are the only three real answers that I can come up with for that. And so that to me sort of struck me as something that implies that there is an objective reality to all these things.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting anyway that the cultural thing for me, when you said that as well, it could be like testing the waters or the drip feeding to see how people will react. I mean, apparently, these beings, they're interested in our way as humans, we have a soul and whatnot. And I know you discuss as part of your kind of work as well. But I think the whole cultural thing as well, to understand that. I mean, the thing that pops up for me as well is we don't hear many stories right now, these about exchanging of food, unless I'm mistaken. But when you hear from experiences, they don't really touch on the kind of exchanging of food. It's more just, I don't know.
Well,
unless, yeah.
Well, so I would, on the surface level, I would agree with you on that. But I think it's important to sort of recontextualize the pageantry with which the UFO phenomena seems to change and adopt to cultural expectations. A good example of this is, around the turn of the 20th century, you had those steampunk airships that evolved into flying saucers, that evolved into black triangles, and nowadays we seem to have drone-like Tic Tacs, right? So if the phenomenon, as Jacques Vallée has proposed, does seem to respond to culture, then you could view the incidence of things like injections or ointments or any sort of substance that's administered to an experiencer as being a variation on the exchange of food and drink as seen in the older encounters. You did see like literal like meals given to the contactees of the 50s and 60s, right? And you still see some food today, some pills and such, but nowadays we get things that are more along the lines of injections and ointments, and still a few drinks are given here and there, beverages. But yeah, you're right. At first glance, it certainly would appear that way.
No, it's interesting. And I mean, obviously, you got your Ecology of the Souls book as well, which is super interesting. What kind of brought you to write that up, and what was the motivation and stuff?
There were a couple of motivations. In addition to just my earlier ethos of trying to like take something that people have mentioned and then carry on their business about, I also like to really challenge myself. I like to challenge myself with things that I find uncomfortable spiritually and politically, and just really try to say, how much do you believe in this, Josh? Let's poke and see how strong you are. And I think that's something that I try to do in my life. So that does factor into it with this. I have heard these stories, and I'm sure you have too at this point, of people who are experiencers who are revealed their past lives during UFO contact, or even weirder to me, and this is not like an ideological or a religious thing, I just didn't know what to do with it, pre-birth memories. I was a glowing ball of light aboard a Zeta Reticulan starship, and you're like, what do I do with this, right? But these stories aren't going away, and there are plenty of them that are out there. So like, how do you reconcile those things? So that's part of it over here. The other part of it was that there are stories. I've been told that it's quite frequent. I have not necessarily seen that, but it definitely happens often enough that it not being mentioned in more literature raises my eyebrows, because it does happen often enough, of the dead seen aboard UFOs, the dead appearing in people's homes after a UFO sighting. I mean, there are lots of stories like this, in addition to poltergeist phenomena popping off after UFO sightings and experiences as well. That's something that doesn't go discussed often enough. So what does that mean? And then this haunting phrase that Anne Strieber, wife of Whitley Strieber, late wife of Whitley Strieber, noted after collecting the tens of thousands of letters that came their way following the publication of Communion. She was sort of noticing trends across all these letters. And at one point, Whitley has mentioned this numerous times, she wrote, "This has something to do with what we call death." I just got chills saying that, because like, what we call death is such an evocative phrase. Just that simple cryptic observation is sort of inspiring in its own way. So I thought that was something that was worth exploring. And then finally, there have been researchers who have put these different contact modalities, have made the comparison between them. Kenneth Ring compared UFO contact to near-death experiences. Eddie Bullard compared shamanic initiations, being a very gross generalization of that particular belief system. Shamanic initiations compared to UFO abductions, and some astounding correspondences there. And the fairy comparisons that have been made, but I really hadn't seen anybody try to put all these things in dialogue with each other. And to me, it seemed natural that the hub at the center of that experiential wheel was, quite frankly, death. I mean, a lot of cultures prior to the rise of theosophy in the late 19th century associated fairies with the dead. You have these stories, as I mentioned, of the dead being seen aboard craft. Near-death experiences obviously focus around death. But shamanic initiations in a lot of these cultures were all about bringing you to or beyond the point of death and then coming back with enhanced abilities, the same kinds of abilities that UFO experiencers and near-death experiencers sort of report. So it seemed to me like this is, in a lot of ways, this is all describing something very similar. And I don't know if these are distinct things interacting with that final transition that we make, or it's all one big thing, right? I don't know. But I thought it was worth exploring the possibilities that are embedded therein. And that's how you end up writing 260,000 words and hating your life the entire time. But yeah, that's the story of Ecology of Souls.
Interesting. All right. And what was the well, I mean, it's interesting. So for me, as you said before, death is the kind of connecting thread to the experiencer and well, kind of the whole phenomena itself in many ways in terms of what is ongoing. And is there anything like a common thread that occurs through that, which you can kind of explain, which kind of connects all the dots with that itself?
There are a couple. There's a phrase that I use several times in the book that seems to be the primary takeaway from a lot of these experiences, which is to die to death. This is sort of what you would hear people returning from the Eleusinian mysteries as saying, is that they sort of overcame their fear of death so that they actually might be empowered to start living. That's one aspect of it. The other aspect I would say is this idea of, going into another space and coming back with talents that can benefit your community. This is something that is very commonly reported amongst near-death experiencers, having extended consciousness abilities, clairvoyance, RSPK, all sorts of anomalies. That was certainly the role of the shaman. But in contemporary Western culture, we don't really have a space for people like alien abductees who are almost suffering from a spontaneous shamanic initiation, if you want to view it that way. And as I alluded to before, like, shamanic is kind of a problematic term because it just applies to, Eurasian, Siberian shaman traditions. But like, there are similar figures throughout a lot of different cultures that fulfill those same rules. But I just see a real problem with our current culture not having a roadmap for the people who have these experiences. It's almost as if there is sort of a shaman quota, I think, that needs to be met on Earth. And when we stop providing them, the universe says, well, we've got to sort of force this upon some of you. But that sort of and here's the thing: the solely extraterrestrial model, I think, does a poor job of helping those people reintegrate and understand some of the post-abduction, post-contact abilities and things that creep into their lives. A lot of people end up flocking to the New Age, which has its own sort of explicative power, but there is a certain ancient aspect to a lot of these older traditions that I think could be especially useful for some of these people.
Any examples, or what would you say in terms of these ancient traditions?
Well, there are some examples of people who have, I'm applying this broadly to near-death experiences and UFO experiences in particular, who do have these encounters, these passing beyond the veil and back into our reality, who will sometimes find that if they don't use these abilities, they tend to sort of build up in negative ways. That's one aspect of it. But you do find a similarity of people who, you find a good number of people who come back from the UFO experience with a sense of mission. And unless that's directed in a certain place, that can lead into, what Robert Anton Wilson called the chapel perilous. It can lead into sort of a space of paranoia and a space of fearing these experiences rather than integrating them. To the contrary, if you can find a way that you can sort of fulfill that sort of drive that you have, these people tend to fare better than those who sort of exist in those experiences with fear. So, you know, that's a model that is embedded in a lot of these spiritual traditions that gets lost in the noise of human alien hybrid projects, and, you know, the Earth being taken over. You know, that's sort of like a bleak aspect. And I'm not saying all these experiences are positive either. I'm saying that they can have positive outcomes. You know, I myself checked myself into rehab for alcoholism in 2020, and I'm open about it. It was not a great experience. It was not fun, but it was also the best thing that happened to me. So I think that is one way that these experiences can be viewed that we don't get when we just sort of lapse into these paranoid interpretations of the phenomenon.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, there's a lot of stuff. I mean, it's very interesting what you're mentioning, because right now, obviously, there's this talk of the threat around the alien experience, the abducted cases, and it can appear that way. But no, I've had my own weird experiences myself, and I think it's down to the individual. And I'm not saying it. I mean, it depends on the person's perspective, what they went through, the situation, and all that type of stuff. But the common thread here is the fact there isn't a particular framework, because you can't really discuss that with anyone who understand what have I just experienced. And this is why, you know, the internet and social media and stuff, people wanted to kind of dig online and find out what the deal is and try and get some perspective or some understanding, then at least they can get some sort of avenue for that information. But if you don't, then it does leave you a bit lost, because you're like, what do I do with this? Not sure what to do with it. And yeah, it can be a long winding road.
Well, and I wonder, you know, if some of these experiences aren't a bit like psychedelic trips and other altered states of consciousness. You go in paranoid, you know, setting is important. You go in paranoid or negative or with some stuff to work out, and you're probably not going to have a great time. But if you approach it in the proper mindset, in the right setting, then you can actually have something that is a transformative experience. You know, I just think that there's some more utility in doing these things that way. Yeah,
no, for sure. And do you have any kind of, I guess, a framework or theory of how best to integrate all of this for people maybe experiencing this, or anything paranormal of that nature?
Right. Well, you know, I'm not one to. I mean, different strokes for different folks, right? Like, I'm not one to say go on an ayahuasca retreat, because that's not for everybody. I haven't done it because I'm too terrified of the concept. I have found refuge in, you know, nature, in trying to distance, you know, nature, and in spiritual traditions, in trying to distance reality from my own thoughts. But again, this is like, for me personally, this sounds like the most hypocritical thing ever, because I lapse into anxiety all the time, right? There's like what you try to do and what you actually are able to accomplish. But you know, that's part of it. I have found, I mean, as I alluded to earlier, I grew up so terrified of the alien abduction scenario that when my sister had ultrasound pictures of her nephew, she's like, you might not want to look at them because they kind of look like gray aliens. Like, I was that like, and you know, the alien abduction researchers would say, oh, that's because you're an experiencer. And I'm like, I don't know. It's kind of a terrifying scenario any way you slice it. But really what allowed me to sort of overcome that fear for myself was the sort of rejection of the extraterrestrial hypothesis, and this idea that, oh, if this has something to do with consciousness, and honestly, you're not going to find a lot of ufologists who will say that it doesn't have something to do with consciousness at this point, right?
Yeah, not now. Yeah, for sure.
No, not now. Yeah. If this has something to do with consciousness, then I've kind of got a foot in the door. Like, I've got a fighting chance for whatever happens to me. And that also led to me sort of, you know, exploring these other alternate interpretations that have said to me, well, you know, maybe this isn't always as negative as it seems. And again, I'm not denying the fact that there are negative forces out there. I think one interpretation of these negative alien abductions is that there's something akin to soul theft in these shamanic traditions, where a spirit would take your soul and give you illness, you know, and you'd have to have a practitioner come and sort of guide your soul back to your body. I think that there's something to that. But like I said, you know, a lot of what we do with our lives are our reactions to what happened to us, rather than just what happens to us. And I'm not dismissing tragedies at all, but sometimes things can be overcome with perspective and that sort of shift that comes along with that. And then, you know, just the acceptance that there are some things sometimes that are beyond our capacity to understand. You know, they've gotten a lot better about it, but my boys, I used to take them to the pediatrician, and they used to, you know, scream and kick and fight. I'm like, this is for your own good. Like, if we don't do this, there are going to be serious ramifications. Or, you know, like taking a pet to the veterinarian, like, it's the same idea. Like, they oftentimes hate it, but like, if this has to happen, things will be better if it does happen. So just realizing that there is the possibility that some things might be outside your scope of understanding that can be for your benefit has been just a useful life lesson in general. And you know, it's one of my criticisms of Christianity as a Christian myself, is that we don't emphasize that enough, that, you know, things like suffering need to be alleviated, and we need to do everything as communities to help prevent that. But it's also part of being a human being on Earth and can be transformative in its own right.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, what you're saying is, you know, I mean, as I said, this is what's helped me as well. Different people can apply your own different ways of it itself. But I think as well, the consciousness thing, as you mentioned, it gave you the thing that is foot in the door, because, you know, the idea of alien beings coming from another solar system in their physical ships, abducting us, you can't really do anything with that. But I think when it comes to consciousness, you can be more connected to that, because it's something that is internal or external, if it's everywhere, if it's not in our brain, but it's something that you can kind of relate to a bit more in that sense, and maybe gives you a bit more control. That's how it occurred to me anyway. When
right. That's to me. That's totally what I resonated with. And to be clear, in case some people aren't familiar with my work, I'm standing here sort of bashing the idea of extraterrestrials. The fundamental thing that I think we can all agree on is that if they're aliens, they're really strange aliens, and they do often have these metaphysical messages and preoccupation with our souls. Could be negative, could be positive, I don't know, but there does seem to be a strong metaphysical component here. And I'm not denying that the UFO phenomenon certainly presents a sort of stellar shape, right? Like, there's a lot of pageantry that we would associate with something like extraterrestrial visitation. But we've always, as Jeffrey Kripal from Rice University has put it, we've always looked up, you know, for the other world. And and I think that says something about the role that UFOs play in the 21st century. So I'm not saying there aren't aliens anywhere. I'm not saying that we haven't even been visited. I'm just saying that this phenomenon tends to be much stranger and literally reality bending than I think a lot of people in the mainstream populace, as opposed to us weirdos. It seems to be stranger than they really apprehend. And that's part of, I think, what the disclosure movement has been trying to, it's part of why it's been slow to see results. Yeah.
It's funny because you're saying it's stranger. I mean, some people will be like, "What's more stranger than aliens coming?" Oh, there's a spiritual element. I mean, that's the folklore and fairies.
I've speculated that's the reason for secrecy. I mean, if you look at sort of the historical antecedents for clamping down on movements, it's usually because they're political or religious, right? Like, those are the primary motivators of secrecy for the past several millennia. And, you know, I can't think of something less empowering to authority structures than the fact that, hey, you are an eternal being, and even if we kill you, it's not really as much of a punishment as we have led you to think it is. You know what I mean? Like, that really undermines authority structures. Yeah. And you know, and I will say, and I dance around this in various interviews, but their Ecology of Souls has wound up on some pretty interesting shelves in people among the disclosure movement. So these ideas are in that sphere. Let's put it that way. It's not strictly an extraterrestrial, a materialist extraterrestrial interpretation that's guiding a lot of the disclosure advocates. I mean, a great example is you know, George Knapp appearing quite frequently with Jeremy Corbell, and George Knapp, I believe he was speaking with James Ian Doley about how you can't separate the supernatural from UFO phenomena. You just can't. It's there. And so what do you do with it, and what does that imply, is the question that consistently fascinates me.
No, exactly. It's just, it's like you can't run away from it. It becomes attached to it, and it's silly to not. I mean, with the dogma around it, it can be easy to push it away. You know, I was speaking to a couple of a friend in a WhatsApp group, and he was like, aliens are not real, blah blah blah, and he was talking about the whole disclosure movement and all that stuff as well. And I was trying to give him information around it, and to myself, I speak to my brother on the side, and I was like, I'm only going to mention the consciousness aspect to him. I'm going to let's just, because if he doesn't believe this bit, he's like, you know, start chucking in the other elements, he's going to be like, no, this is no way possible. Leave me out of it. I'm done.
But it's been so surprising to me. Over the past like 5 years, the number of people that I start having these conversations with who say, well, I don't think they're aliens, I think they're interdimensional. And I'm like, what? Like, that's not something that your average person would have ever said, you know, 10 years ago. And you know, I've historically been, and I've been trying to do sort of a crow eating tour, as it were. I've been historically very critical of the disclosure movement. And I do think that viewing that as some sort of apotheosis of revelation is the wrong way to look at what the goals truly are. I always envision disclosure as, you know, the president standing up there and saying, you know, my fellow Americans, you know, here's the alien. His name is Klabzar, and he's from the Carflaxian Confederation, and he, you know, and this is what they are here for, and all this stuff. Like a very explicit disclosure of information. And I think what the true goal of that movement is, that I had misinterpreted, is to just put a crack in the wall, right? Mm-hmm. The comparison that I would make now is that 15 years ago, you would go up to someone and ask them their opinion of the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and you get a lot of people who adhered to the typical narrative, right? Yeah. Nowadays, you'd be hard-pressed to find someone who doesn't say something funny is there, right? And that's been a slow process that is just inserting doubt, right? It's just inserted doubt into people's minds. And I think that's what the true goal of UFO disclosure advocates has been, is to just insert enough doubt into your average person that they say something strange is happening. And I think it's reaching critical mass in that regard. There are a lot of people who are willing to admit that something strange is happening, even if they don't necessarily buy into the idea of visitation from other planets.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's definitely been a change in the masses in terms of being open to it, or at least, I mean, I think, you know, they would be like, yeah, they could be live, but now it's like, yeah, I think it would actually make sense, bearing in mind. And I think the whole consciousness aspect, it is becoming a lot more connected to the topic as well. I mean, in Lou Elizondo's book as well, Imminent, I don't know if you've read it, I've read it, but it's he talks quite heavily about the whole remote viewing, the psychic elements to it, the angel demon. I mean, that's what he said as well. You said about the angel demons, that would be the best way to keep it a secret as well, because you wouldn't want to bring that out. That's apparently one of his theories, or one of the government's theories as well around it as well, why they're trying to keep this subject so down and under. Right. I mean, whether actually angels or demons is another thing. Maybe that's a perception of it littered through history, and that's what it's come up to. But yeah, I could see why it would take time to kind of grow that field.
And so much of where I come from and what I have trouble reconciling is the fact that if we're going to deal with something as simple, quote unquote simple, as telepathy or remote viewing, right? That shatters our conceptions of cause and effect, of materialism, of physicalism. Like, it implies that our philosophical models, our widely held philosophical models, are broken, right? And at that point, why do they have to be physical beings from another planet? Like, they could be anything, and I mean anything, including physical beings from another planet, but they could be anything. And so, like, let's not let's not just stay in one corner of the playground, right? Like, let's use the whole darn thing. Like, you know, there are a lot of different slides and you know and places to climb. Yeah,
there's a lot of fun stuff there. Do you think the paranormal topic better explains the UFO topic then, compared to kind of the typical extraterrestrial hypothesis?
I have yeah. I mean, yeah. I would say more broadly, like the metaphysical comparison. You know, the sort of ancient aliens trend that we've seen over the past couple of decades has been like, what if the gods were actually aliens? And I'm leaning more towards like, what if the aliens were actually gods?
Yeah.
Because you do have these like experiences that I have trouble fitting near-death experiences into anything other than a narrative of transcendence, right? There's something happening there. And like, look, the near-death research is really good. I mean, there are people who come back with information that they could not have had. There are examples where people die on the operating table, come back and say, hey, Uncle Dave is dead. And they go, no, Uncle Dave's not dead. Let me call up Uncle Dave. And it turns out he died while the person was, had flatline brain activity and heart rhythms, right? It's really good stuff. And so where does that come from? I don't know. Akashic records, morphogenetic fields, afterlife traditions, I don't know. But that is part of this. And people come back with the same suite of experiences, or the same suite of talents, I would say, that a lot of people with extended UFO contact experience. The same things you saw from people going to fairyland, the same things you see in shamanic initiations, the same things, honestly, that some people get after really good psychedelic trips. It all seems to be like some space other than here that you go and you can come back and there's like a residue of talent that you get and keep. And when you factor in the prevalence of UFOs and UFO and alien imagery across all those experiences, it does to me suggest that something spiritual, metaphysical is behind this. Now, of course, I say spiritual and people lapse into Christian dichotomies of good and evil and angels and demons. I'm not even saying that. I've got my own personal beliefs, but I'm not even saying that. I'm just saying that something beyond this reality, and you can call it another dimension if you want to. That's fine with me. I would think that the afterlife might be another dimension, right? But something like that. And if you've never read Kenneth Ring's The Omega Project, it's a great read because he does sort of situate the near-death experience and the UFO contact against each other and sort of outline a lot of the similarities, some of which I outlined as well. But I saw a tweet a while back that was like, well, if UFO experiences and near-death experiences are so similar, why don't aliens appear in NDEs? I'm like, well, hold on. Number one, I've collected stories of grays in near-death experiences. Yeah. I've also collected stories of deities aboard spaceships. Do with that what you will. But the fact of the matter is that we overestimate how much pop culture has shaped our interpretations of UFO contact. By which I mean, there have been certain studies done. The Edgar Mitchell Freeze studies that were done probably about 10 years ago now. I can't believe that. But Ray Hernandez's work shows that beings of light and beings that look like humans are perhaps even more common in UFO experiences than the grays ever were. And beings of light and beings that appear human are staples of the near-death experience too. So I think we just really need to sort of reevaluate the biases that we approach these topics with and sort of start from square one in some regards, because controversial statement, we don't know anything about this stuff, right? There's a lot of speculation. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of people who've had personal experiences, which I believe that people relate to me their experiences as they happen. I do not cast any doubt on them. I just don't always trust the voice at the other end of the phone line, if you know what I mean. I don't know. They said that they were from, Beetlejuice. Well, that's what they said. I don't know if that's true or not. I don't know if that's a way for you to wrap your head around this existing in the extraterrestrial milieu that we do. I don't know if that's deliberate deception in a negative way. I don't know, but I don't always trust that information, but I do trust experiencers. So not taking away anything that people are saying, but for the rest of us who have these experiences not at all or less often, there are just a lot of unanswered questions beyond the fact that I think we can all agree on that something isn't right. we're getting only part of the story.
No, absolutely. And that was something I wanted to ask as well in terms of the observer and experience, in terms of shaping the UFO counter itself. Is there like an interactive element? And you kind of mentioned it just there in the sense where it's down to pop culture and maybe what would apply to that person and their experiences and their perception for them to receive whatever that message could be.
Right. No, I mean, and this has been an idea that's been kicked around for a while. My current project is kind of exploring this to a degree, but it's this idea that there's a certain amount of indeterminacy to the phenomenon. And we sort of touched upon this with the idea of set and setting and whatnot, how that might sort of shape these interactions. But the thing itself, like the UFO itself, the alien itself, the cryptid itself, the fairy itself, might be just as much a product of our expectations as it is the phenomenon appearing one way or the other. You know, you do have stories of people who will all agree that they saw a UFO, but they disagree on color, they disagree on shape. A good friend of mine, you know, was out walking with her mother, and she saw a silvery UFO sort of stair-stepping through the West Virginia sky, and her mother remembered a red bird. Now, you can fall back and say screen memories, which would be the stance of most orthodox ufologists. I've never heard screen memories really defined very well in terms of mechanism or how that's accomplished to my satisfaction. But you could fall back on screen memory, or you could say that there was something there, but in terms of what the people needed to see, were prepared to see, that might have had some bearing on the way that it manifested. And there's some evidence in cognitive science to suggest this. My good friend and mentor, Greg Bishop, has been working for a while on a book about co-creation, which is the idea that we do bring our cultural expectations to these experiences, and that sort of forms the way that they appear to us. It's an old idea. You can find it in John Keel and Druffel, Hilary Evans. A lot of these older researchers have been kicking around this idea for a while, but it's never really coalesced in any sort of meaningful way, and I'm excited to see what Greg does with that. But as an example of one hypothesis that I have entertained, one of the uniting features of all paranormal phenomena, ghosts, NDEs, fairies, UFOs, cryptids, all these things, are anomalous lights, right? You hear this all the time: ghost lights, spook lights, and what we call them is always dependent upon the setting, right? Like, you know, if you see it in a house, it's a ghost. If you see it in the sky, it's a UFO. If you see it bobbing across an old hill fort, oh, it's a fairy, right? I wonder if that's not what this phenomena looks like, stripped of all expectations. Is just that light, right? It's just the light, and then how it appears to us is what we are contributing to the other side of that. I think it's really interesting that light does play a factor in DMT production inside of us, and a lot of these experiences share a lot in common, as I'm sure you know, with you know, DMT trips. So what if the light, which is sometimes described as having an odd sort of character to it, is facilitating an endogenous dump of dimethyltryptamine that we all have in our systems, and we meet it in that space with our cultural expectations and our baggage and what we want to see, or maybe what we don't want to see. We meet it in that space, and that's where we have these experiences where it's like, oh, it looked like a Bigfoot nor an alien. There are counter arguments to that, and I have counter arguments to the counter arguments, but we don't necessarily need to go there for right now. Just be aware that I'm aware of them. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of really interesting ideas out there to explain why these things seem to be endlessly variable in terms of how they appear to us. Yeah,
I think, for me personally, I think the fact that if consciousness is everything and it's all one mind and we can interact with it, and I mean, the fact that people have these innate abilities, or they gain abilities from going through whatever paranormal, spiritual, alien type experience they've gone through, and they come back, then certainly our observability on what is happening would have an effect. It seems like I mean, I'm going to say logical approach to a subject which is pretty insane if you think about it on paper, but I think that would make sense to it in that sense. I mean, you've got the whole slit experiment as well, which is the most famous one in terms of, you know, observing, watching it, and it changes on it. So it would make sense that would be it, and that's why people see these different things. And then if we're tying in, I mean, I'm trying to come up with a theory right now.
but this is exactly what we were talking about at the beginning, right? It's about your reaction to things. It's about how you sort of deal with things that happen to you and how you frame it. And, you know, I think that you're dead on. And this is what I'm really enjoying about our conversation right now, is because, like, I've done interviews where I sit down and the questions are like, so where did the aliens come from? And it's like, I mean, like, I'm not trying to be pretentious or a jerk or anything, but like there's so many deeper questions that this whole phenomenon begs.
We can't answer that anyway. We can't answer the other ones as well. But like,
there's literally probably a list of 150. No, there's probably a list of 1,500 planets that have been mentioned over the years. Right? So yeah, I mean, yeah, but that's what I really appreciate about this conversation that we're having, is that like this is the place where we are being called to go by this, and to the extent that I'm not always sure that isn't the purpose of this, is to act as a doorway, act as a vector. I mean, a good example that I use is Ami Michel, French ufologist, said that ufology was the only discipline where you start looking at sightings in the sky and end up reading ancient Arab mystics, you know. and that's very true. Like, this has led me to explore parts of the world and parts of myself that I never would have touched if I hadn't had, you know, UFOs and cryptids and all this strange stuff as a gateway to those things.
Yeah, and I think, you know, I think that's probably one of the main points of it, really. You know, I've said this many times before. It must be like when people ask you questions. So, what do you do for a living, Joshua? How do you get to the UFO subject?
I avoid that question as much as I can.
Do you know what? When I have to explain to people, I'm like, by the way, guys, I didn't wake up one day like this, right? There's been a series of events that have happened, and it makes you question reality, your life, and you push it away, then it comes back again, and then that's how it's been for me, back and forth. And ultimately, what I think it is just opening up your mind and the idea of that who we think we are is not who we think we are. And there's so much more out there. The universe and the world is a glorious place, and we should be a lot more inquisitive. So for me, it's taught me to be very curious, question things. Like, don't look at a face. And I question everything as well. That's why people may think, oh, he believes in aliens. He's like, and I'm like, bro, brother, sister, whoever you are, that's not the case. Like, I've looked into this because I wanted to know this aliens. This could be bullshit. Let me look, and then you see recurring themes, and then things pop up. And the consciousness thing, for example, and the spiritual stuff, man, I tell you, about 8 years ago, or whatever, I did not believe that stuff. I was like, no, it's physical. Maybe it's too much for me, wasn't right. But in divine time, I eventually, through research and experiences, I connected it. And actually, the consciousness thing paranormal makes the most sense to me, because it's one of the key things that have followed me throughout my personal life itself. So I don't know where I'm going with this.
Well, no, but here's what I hear from you saying that is that this is like any sort of initiatory process, right? Like, you can't explain it to somebody. They have to go through it themselves, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, I realize that to a lot of people who aren't familiar with this topic, it makes us sound like a couple of nutters, right? But, but I think that's a big part of this. And to that extent that you mentioned, it does have this re-enchanting quality. I mean, a good example that I use is I went with my boys on a field trip to a children's museum, and I found myself staring at like a geology exhibit. And like, look, if you're into geology, that's fine. You do you. Like, it's just never really been my thing. But something in that, I can't remember exactly what, it's not the point of this. Something in that geology exhibit spoke to something else that spoke to something else that spoke to the UFO thing. I found it more interesting than I had, you know. And I think that's a beautiful thing. And that's the lesson that you come out on the other side of this, I think, is that like, we already live in like a psychedelic, weird, magical reality. And we just have been entrained to not appreciate that.
No, absolutely. I mean, the whole system puts it down to, you know, work, make money, have a family, retire. And there's a lot more involved with it itself as well. And I think deep down, everyone knows this, that there is more to it, but you get saturated with the news, making money, materialism, all these different things, and then you lose sight of what is of the grandeur of life itself. And I think that's one of the key concepts you kind of gain from any sort of supernatural experiences. I mean, my family's I'm Romany Gypsy background. I'm half English, or quarter English, quarter Irish. But 3/4 has that kind of gypsy trait there, that Romany Gypsy trait, which is very spiritual, enchanted, and I kind of grew up with this whole spiritual side, and like my mum would be doing teacup readings, and like my uncle was a psychic. He's probably listening to he won't listen to this. He doesn't believe it. He doesn't go to graveyards. He fucking hates them as well. He's like, can't. But like that kind of thing around it kind of was there always, but I never connected it to the kind of UFO topic itself. But the more I kind of went into it, I was like, that's so cool that it's all kind of connected together. And for me, it made sense. It gave a bit of clarity to why not just me, but there's other people in my family who've had these strange experiences itself. And it's something I wanted to, you can comment on that as well, but it's something I wanted to ask you as well in terms of particular clans and traits, because I saw an interview before, and I think you mentioned about, I think Lou Elizondo mentioned about the Cherokee clan itself and how they're connected. They're one of the most connected to the spiritual and consciousness aspect as well. I mean, what's your thoughts on that? In particular, clans having these abilities more so, and so, yeah.
Specifically like bloodlines and
yeah.
I mean, there does seem to be sort of a familial component to some of this stuff. I've seen that too often to deny, and that is, again, I would add, consistent with, you know, certain shamanic traditions where you inherited the title from your parents or, you know, from a related family member. So there's something to it. I do start to get a little bit uncomfortable when it's like this bloodline or this you know, this race of people or something
has save the world.
Affinity. Yeah, it's like, where are we going with this? You know, but and here's the other reason that I don't always resonate with that is I think that the ability to have these experiences is something akin to music is a good example, or any sort of other art. Like there's some people who have these sort of natural aptitudes. I know people who have never received a lick of formal instruction, who can pick up just about any instrument and obnoxiously enough play whatever they want to. You know what I mean? I love, so I hate those people. They're just wired differently, though. You know, I'm someone who always had to work at it, and I think that like whatever this thing is, I suspect that it operates a bit like that. Like we all have this ability. Some of us just are more attuned to that than others. So that's sort of where I land. That's not evidence-based. That's sort of like, that's more of a philosophical position. And the reason that the other reason that I've sort of avoided those sort of like, you know, families or lineages being more aligned with the phenomenon is that it reminds me a bit of, I see an inconsistency in the number of, in the things that it suggests. Let me provide that by way of explanation. If you spend any time in like the ghost community, you will hear that all sorts of things are contributors to hauntings, right? Like, you know, oh, there's quartz underground. And then the next person will be like, no, it's granite underground. The next person will be like, no, it's running water underground. It's like, okay, well, which is it? You know, which is it? If this was a thing, I would think that it would all point in the same direction. I'm not saying that those aren't factors, but like saying, oh, it's that one thing, you know, I would expect more consistency from observations than sort of like these different interpretations suggest. So similarly with the idea of like bloodlines, like I would think that we'd say like, hey, look, it's always people from Casey, Iowa that have the most UFO experiences, you know what I mean? And all the data would sort of point in that direction. But I read things that like, you know, oh, it's people from this part of the world or people from that part of the world or people with this blood type or people with that blood type. And there's so much noise there that I kind of just go, okay, well, I'm going to engage with this less. So I'm not saying that that isn't a factor. Obviously there is, as I alluded to, some sort of hereditary component to this. But as far as like specific ethnicities or anything like that, I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. And I think, you know, even you listening to say that, I feel like for it to be targeted towards a particular bloodline, it's either they have been more practicing the kind of spiritual elements to be more in touch, but that's more down to practice. It's not down to a particular consciousness being or something picking a particular race because of their bloodline, because that would be egotistical.
Well, you know, it does sort of remind me of the fact that in certain ancestor worship traditions in different parts of the world, I'm thinking of some African communities specifically that do this. People can be included or excluded from ancestor worship or from the lineage, from the family. You can have someone who violates a severe taboo, and guess what? you are no longer part of who we will meet in the afterlife, and they sort of push them to the margin. Similarly, like someone can be adopted, or a close familial friend can actually become part of that lineage too. So I suspect that it might be something more akin to that. I think that I think that all reality actually doesn't function on rules and laws. I think it functions on strong suggestions and guidelines.
Yeah. No, it's fair. Do you one thing that I've seen quite a lot is you've touched on it quite a few times in terms of these individuals who have experiences, and they have communication with these higher beings, these higher entities, and some of them develop relationships with them as well. I got a book that I read years ago called Noda, I think Noda, and but yeah, I mean, what's your kind of take on being able to kind of develop relationship with these higher beings and the kind of conversations they have as well?
Again, it all comes down to what's on the other end of that conversation, or what's on the other end of that relationship. I mean, in Ecology of Souls, for example, I go in a lot of different directions, and I don't really think I settle on anything. I mean, they might be ancestors, they might be a part of ourselves, an exteriorized part of ourselves. I don't like the idea that these phenomena are generated by human beings, like projections of some sort, but there's evidence to suggest that. I also have to say that there is a strong tendency for human beings to have an affinity or a relationship, a longitudinal relationship throughout their lives with something that is not themselves, that is on this other side. You'd look to the traditions of celestial spouses, as Mircea Eliade would have called them in the shamanic traditions, or fairy spouses, or, totem animals, totem spirits, all these different things sort of point to that sort of relationship as well. So yeah, and that's, there is something to it. I think that's a core part of this thing. I'm just not sure of how much of it comes from us or comes from the phenomenon itself. I mean, you look at something even like witches' familiars, where there was a relationship there. There are some scholars who say that is sort of an aspect of the witch's self that's been exteriorized and projected. That leads us down a whole another conversation about concepts of separable souls and whatnot. But the other thing that I would emphasize is that we have a really poor soulcraft in the contemporary West, and that's partially Christianity is to blame for that. There's this idea that like you have a soul and you might have something called a spirit, maybe, but like if you look at these older traditions, a lot of indigenous beliefs, Egyptian beliefs, Norse beliefs, they endorse a perspective of polypsychism, that we had multiple souls within ourselves. I mean, for example, the Egyptians at one point posited up to 9 different souls.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, and these would sort of guide us in different ways throughout our lives, and we still talk about this kind of today. My head wants to do this, but my heart wants to do this. Like we still detect that sort of struggle. But like once you start looking at like, okay, well maybe there are a lot of different things inside of me, a lot of different aspects to myself, and then you place that alongside these almost universal beliefs that these aspects of ourselves could go wandering, especially during sleep or during moments of trance or during severe illness. An aspect of ourselves could actually leave our bodies and go off and do something else. It starts to make you wonder how much of this is a part of ourselves. And again, I could be wrong about everything I've said today, right? But I will say that I strongly suspect that these experiences don't seem to be prepared for, massive amounts of people. I mean, like we can talk about Fatima and the miracle of the sun and like the Phoenix lights and stuff like that, but like the actual transformative individual experiences are tailor-made for individuals. Like it is for you. Synchronicities are the same way, quite frankly. Like you could tell me your most profound synchronicities and I'd be like, okay, great. Dreams are like that too, right? Like you might have the most amazing dream, and I'm like, okay, because it's not for me, it's for you. It means something to you. So I think that there's probably a lesson in there somewhere.
Absolutely. And I think, well, you just said it. It's all lessons, probably. I mean, I don't know what is directing us and what is going on,
Right.
but most of it
That's
feels
the
like
big question.
lessons.
Yeah.
It is literally, I mean, that's probably the biggest thing you can take from it is why would I experience that? Why am I seeing that? What am I gaining from? And I think you should take that process into any area of your life, by the way, not just with any kind of UFO experiences. You take that into anything. Why am I experiencing this? What is happening? What am I learning from it? Right? Whether it's, you know.
Right. And in keeping with this theme that you and I have sort of been playing with here, I think there can be a certain indeterminacy to what that lesson is trying to convey, right? Like it doesn't have to mean the same thing for everybody.
No.
Right.
Yeah,
it can mean something just for you. Like, yeah.
It's got to be personal, and that's probably when the synchronicity will pop up. If you recognize it. That's why SATs work for me. You recognize, you're like, okay, that makes sense, and then you put it together, and then the more you kind of dig into it, the more it makes sense. But I think with that disclaimer, you have to be careful as well, because there's this whole. I'm watching Arrested Development at the moment. I don't know if you've seen it.
It's one of my favorite series.
Really,
ever.
I just finished. Well, didn't they took off Parks and Recreation from Amazon Prime in the UK? Really annoying.
Well, just do me a favor and just stop at the end of season 3 and just sit.
Oh, does it fall off a cliff? Oh,
well,
no.
yeah. Well, I mean, season 4 has its moments, but like I couldn't even get into season 5, and like
Really?
as someone who was a rabid Arrested Development fan, the fact that there's an entire season that I have not finished that's out there boggles my mind. But like that's what all our cherished properties are doing these days, right? Like you just have to sort of like give yourself a cutoff and not watch anymore.
No, it's true. It's the same with The Office, the American one. That was if you don't know if you've seen that, but that was just incredible. But then I won't spoil it. People may have seen it, but it gets to a point where it falls off a cliff later on during the seasons, and I'd say that'll be the cutoff, even if I finished it. But yeah, there's I forgot the guy's name with the bald head and the moustache.
Tobias.
Yeah, Tobias. But you know, right? He's all like, the universe has told me to do this, and so this is the. So I think there's a fine line between controlling that and not just also staying in reality as well. And it's something I've learned recently as well, between taking the message, accepting it, but ground yourself with it as well. Doesn't mean you have to kind of pick up and travel to this part of the world or do this or sell your house, sell your business, still be in reality at the same point, but take something substantial and implement it. That means like being strategic with it as well at the same time.
Well, yeah, I mean, you've got to have the self-awareness to go, isn't it amazing? The universe is telling me to do all these things that I really want to do. Like you've got to have the self-awareness to be like, yeah, maybe it doesn't quite work that way.
Exactly. So I just want to say as a disclaimer in there as well, with any kind of messages you get. But synchronicities are a thing. They do pop up, and they come at the most uncanny times as well, which is kind of strange, and they just pop up for you as well. But I think it is all kind of guidelines, signs. Like we're probably like just walking down the road. The road of life, whatever that may look like, probably grass and fire on one side, good and bad. I'm being quite creative right now with my imagination. And then we just got guideposts. Something pops up, we go that way, we go that way. But I think ultimately, if we do stay in tune and connect and actually listen and take it, if we do sway off a little bit, then we do redirect back to the path where we get to. That's what I think, and I think it's something to hold. This is what helps me, by the way, to hold on to these things when things are not going so good. And even when they're bad, even when they're good or bad, it's good to think that you're going in a particular direction, and that's where you take it from there. Because, and I think these experiences or any sort of paranormal, anything else that happens or pops up around you, is just little guideposts that kind of nudge you along the right path. And some people may get a message from their dead mom who's passed away 20 years ago, or some people may have an alien experience, or some people may get a synchronicity. I don't know how it occurs to you. It probably occurs to you depending on what resonates best with you as well, I guess. Right. I could be incredibly wrong, by the way.
No, I think you're right in that regard. And you know, synchronicities is sort of like guardrails. You know, they're not gonna keep you on the road, but they're, you know, if you just sort of like let them guide you, they will put you back in shape. I mean, or back on track. And it's the sort of thing where I neither subscribe to the idea that everything has to be hard, nor that everything has to be easy. But I do think that there should be, in my experience, life has worked best when I have responded to natural paths and affinities that I've had that are sort of like, okay, well, this comes easier to me than other people, so I'm going to go with this right now, as opposed to, like, you know, fighting it or taking the path of least resistance, like being like, okay, well, this is still work, but it sort of I can do it. I can accomplish this with a little bit more ease and enjoyment than I might something else. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's very true. That's very true. And we do like to go through things that resist because we like a challenge and we think that we have to be better and stronger. We have to self-improve, and that whole kind of process pops into our mind. But I think you're right. We've got to do what we love, what comes easy to us. And that's probably ties into your passions. And I mean, that's why I wanted to ask you from the start, the get-go, right? Why music? What kind of, and you said you like it kind of popped up for you in that particular way as well, because that's the way it could. And then when you take those steps as well, it does take you. You'll be interested when you're doing something that comes easy or you enjoy the kind of path it takes you on, as opposed to, yeah.
And I think everybody's got something like this. Like, you know, the person that you meet at the bus stop today probably has no idea that if they would actually, you know, find the opportunity, they'd be the best person in the world at gluing keys onto a keyboard or something random like that. Like there's some sort of talent that we all have that we would just have, that just lies latent and dormant in us. And I think that's part of, I don't know. I mean, we're getting really philosophical right now, but like that might be one of the things that we're put here to do, is to figure out what the heck that thing is.
Yeah.
You know, and you know, who knows, there might be stuff that I'm better at that I have never even engaged with, but.
Well, listen, you should give yourself some credit, mate. You've jumped in the UFO paranormal crazy world, and like you've written books and stuff, and that takes something, right? Because, you know, it can be, even if the topic is becoming more mainstream in that sense as well, it takes individuals like yourself to go out there and have the courage to do that as well. And you know, that's something to be really proud of as well. And that's why these podcasts and stuff like that, I'm sure that it's all about education, opening up, planting that one little seed, and it could be the most basic bit of information that, who knows, and then that person's walking down the road in their three-piece suit going to their corporate office. I'm trying to paint a very stereotypical picture here, and then they're like, 1 second, and then that seed grows, and that's what I think it's about. And it's about kind of sharing that message. And I do think, bearing in mind the whole UFO topic as well, and this is why you talked about disclosure and that kind of ideal, what it kind of looks like. I mean, you're right. We can paint the picture of the president standing up saying, "Here's Paul, the great alien."
As I said to an audience one time, I said, "Okay, I want you to imagine that the person that you didn't vote for last time is president now, and they're telling you that they're aliens. Do you believe them?" Like it's just not gonna. I don't think it's gonna happen like that. I think we're in an era where there's so much distrust of authority, like a 50-50 split, right? Mm-hmm. I think there's so much distrust of authority that like we are past the point where anybody's going to take at face value a statement like we have a crashed flying saucer. Like it's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen.
I mean, for the current disclosure movement as well, since we're discussing that now, is I think for me the main purpose of it is to get information, because people need evidence, as they call it, and data and I think trying to get acknowledgement from them will help. Well, it will help people. It would have global ramifications, really, if the government did admit to this. But whether they're going to admit to that and what that kind of looks like and the outcome of it, I think may be a difference between what is happening, and it's going to be much more difficult. So it's probably going to be a process of pushing up a giant boulder up a hill, and hopefully, as that happens, the boulder's getting bigger and bigger, and we're collecting people in that sense.
You know, I think it is, and I think it's the weird sort of brand of mysticism that I embrace tells me that there's a reason that UFO disclosure has been more successful in the 2020s than it ever has been. And that's because, of course, UFOs are becoming mainstream as reality seems to fall apart around us. You know, before we got on here, we were talking about the news and how there's just so much to keep up with. I don't think it's just a factor of 24-hour news cycles, because it's really more like a 30-minute news cycle now. I don't think it's just a factor of that. I don't think it's just a factor of being more connected. That plays a part of it. But like, I'm also reminded of some of the things that Terence McKenna said about, you know, spiraling out into ever increasing complexity and novelty as we approach the transcendental object at the end of time. But I mean, but that sounds to very accurately describe what's been happening since 2020. And of course UFOs would be a part of that. I mean, it's trickster time, right? Just is.
Yeah.
So
I think
that doesn't give me a warm fuzzy feeling. I can tell you that, but I kind of wonder if that's part of it too.
I think it was Keith Thompson I was speaking to, who called it the trickster thing as well. I spoke to him recently as well, and he kind of was like, it's the whole trickster side of it as well. And I mean, if when you look at it from that perspective, it does appear that way as well. But as you said, it's what we take from the whole experience as well. What do you think? I mean, so if you think, I mean, and some people also say with disclosure that they're already here, the aliens are here already. There's nothing really to disclose, right? It's all kind of just getting people to catch up on the whole alien phenomena itself. How do you think the whole disclosure movement is going to pan out then, in your opinion, of course?
Well, I have friends who suggest that interest in UFOs, like using Google Analytics, has shown that interest in UFOs actually peaked back in 2008. So, I don't know. Google is not necessarily reality, right? I think that, look, disclosure does seem to come in seasons. It comes in waves, and I think that, to use a sports metaphor, the ball has been significantly moved down the field this time. I think that it's going to be a while for people to integrate and come to grips with the possibility, so that they wind up in that place of comfortably saying, yeah, something is strange here. And then, maybe in a couple more years, we'll see a new sort of disclosure fervor. But I suspect, and this isn't me being negative, this is me just like trying to perceive things objectively. I suspect that this current disclosure season has either ended or is ending. Now, I may be proven wrong, right? Predictions age like milk. You got to be careful. But that doesn't mean that this is the last that we'll hear of it. I suspect that, I should hope that if we ever get the chance to have world events settle down, the question will be revisited, and we will, get a little bit further towards our goal. But I think that there's so much going on right now that we might be looking at a 3 steps forward, 2 steps back kind of situation in terms of the emphasis that the public places on it.
Do you think, like the likes of David Grush, Lou Elizondo, and the whole government having crash retrieval programs, do you believe that?
Oh my goodness, this is kind of an odd question to bring up at the last minute. Yes, I think that there are materials that are in the possession of various authorities that are linked to the phenomenon. I question the interpretation as crashed saucery bits, by which I mean, and I'm going to be talking about this in an upcoming project to a certain degree, but they have been analyzed to be anomalous, and the assumption is, they weren't made on this Earth. But few people stop to say, does that mean that they can't be made in this reality? In which case, if that is indeed what's happening, and again, I know this is an odd thing to say, and I'm going to sort of buttress this argument in something I've got coming up, but I would put them more in alignment with things like saints' relics and apports and poltergeist cases and these other things that have a undeniable physicality to them, and oftentimes sort of conform to a narrative, but are not necessarily what they appear to be, if that makes any sense. I mean, the issue of saints' relics is kind of interesting in and of itself, because you'll find finger bones of saints, and they're like 15 of them scattered across the world, and you're like, okay, so this saint had 15 fingers. So obvious frauds, quote unquote, that nonetheless still display some miraculous abilities to heal people, or for the blood that's been congealed for centuries to turn liquid on the day of the saint's birth or death or something, things along those lines. So that's where my perspective on crash retrievals is. Again, I know that interpretation does not sit well with people. It sounds like I'm being dishonest and doing mental gymnastics, but I have some information that I think might change some minds that I've learned from some other researchers. So
okay,
hopefully that'll be out there sooner rather than later. Yeah.
Interesting. I know it's last minute, but I just thought I'd always ask that question because this is,
that's an entire show unto itself, right? Yeah.
I know. I'm more interested. I just wanted, I mean, obviously your line of work is more than kind of the stuff we've been discussing anyway, but it's always interesting to get your take on kind of where we're going and stuff.
But it's a great question, because if as again, to quote Saint Terence of McKenna, if it's real, it can handle the pressure. And
say do the accent.
Yeah, right. If it's real, it can handle the pressure. So like, you shouldn't be forced to exclude data points because they don't conform to your own little pet theory. Even if it's just saying, I don't know how this fits in, that's better than just ignoring it. So like, yeah, I think it has to be addressed, and it's something that I hopefully will be addressing in the very near future, and something that's coming out.
Interesting. Well, that brings me on to my next question. The final segment. I know the people watching this are crying. Like, no, don't finish this yet. So in terms of next projects and stuff, what is going on with yourself then, Joshua? I know you've been extremely busy.
Yeah, I've got a couple of projects where I'm partnering with some individuals. I am 60-70% through another solo project. And then, of course, after that, it's going back and reading it and hating my life and editing it and debating whether or not I should just throw it in the trash. No. So I anticipate probably spring of 2025 that coming out.
Cool.
And
is that a book then? Sorry, is that another book?
It'll be a book. It's about again, this is a whole nother topic, but it's about these eruptions of fictions into reality. I don't know if you're familiar with Alan Moore's famous story about meeting Constantine in a sandwich shop. Yeah, he has a story. Again, it's one of those things where it's like, I see that and I'm like, I don't know what to do with this. Like the pre-birth memories, it's like, I don't know what to do with this. So I've got to try to figure out what I do with this. So looking at that and those tendencies as they manifest in ufology, in cryptozoology, in parapsychology, in addition to, authors saying that they interact with their characters and that they see their characters, which happens a lot. Like, oh geez, Kipling, Shelley, like all these, like some of these people that we really hold up as luminaries are like, yeah, I saw my character, he or she walked into the study one day and we had a conversation. And it's like, what do you do with that?
Yeah, I never knew that.
Does that say something about this phenomenon? If this phenomenon is consciousness based, where it revolves around consciousness, like, couldn't it play with that too? So, I'm excited about it. It's very different than what I've done in the past. So I've got that. There's some other media projects that I'm just superstitious enough to not talk about until they're actually in progress. You know what I mean? I don't want them to fall apart.
I get that. Yeah.
But it's all eating up a lot of my time right now. So I'm hoping that 2025 will see some interesting releases from me.
Exciting. All right, cool. Well, you obviously got the bug and you can't let it go. So it's impossible. But okay, good. And where can we find you, Joshua?
Yeah, JoshuaCutchin.com, JoshuaCutchin.com has links to all my interviews, some books. If you're in the continental US, I do ship signed copies from me. But if you're international, I just don't trust the U.S. Post anymore after having some stuff get lost.
You can always come to the UK if you wanted to.
I would love to. Well, it might be happening sometime in the future. We'll have to see. But it's. I hope to get there before I slip into the UFO afterlife. Yeah.
Got it. All right, good stuff. Well, listen, look, I'll include all the links in the description so everyone watching or listening can check all your stuff out. But yeah, Joshua, it's been a really great conversation, and it's I do love talking about this particular topic, and even more so the kind of paranormal consciousness elements as well. I find it very fascinating, the altered realities, what they mean, and it gets me going. It gets me going. It's like a late evening coffee for me, because that's what.
Yes, yeah, I agree. Well, this was an absolute delight. So thank you for having me.
No, pleasure. Superb. Well, listen, maybe we'll do it again some point, and hopefully it won't take 3-4 times to get it all
right. Yeah, I agree. I would love to.
Good stuff. Okay, man. All right. Well, listen, pleasure speaking with you, and yeah, take care. I'll catch you later.
All right. Sounds good.